Hello, everybody, and welcome to this fireside chat. I am very honored to be here with the founders of IOHK. We only have 30 minutes. This is not a 45-minute panel, so I'm going to ask you both to do a very quick introduction, and then we could just jump right into the discussion. So, Charles, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Hi, I'm Charles Hoskinson, the CEO of IOHK. We're a research and development company. We build cryptocurrencies like Cardano and Ethereum Classic, and this is my co-founder, Jeremy Wood.
Thank you for inviting me. They don't actually bring me on stage very often, so.
Right, actually it's very rare. I've been to 30 countries this year, 38 events. And this is, I think, the last country. Actually, no, Scotland is next. But this is the first time this year I've actually appeared on a panel with Jeremy. So it's a really special panel. He's the smart one.
All right, I'm excited to hear from both of you. So, I want to kick things off with a concept that seems fundamental to the idea of IOHK. You guys say that this was your founding principle. And I was hoping you guys could tell us a little bit about cascading disruption and what it means to this space.
So the concept of cascading disruption, and by the way, we spent a long time, we said we need a two-word tagline, and we were trying, like, how in 2 words do we emphasize this company, right? You know, like, be strong, or just do it, or something like that, you know. So we were walking in Osaka down the arcade, and we said, how about this concept of being like the initial domino, the first push, the initial inertia towards changing a market? Because if you look at marketplaces, you look at how the world is structured, we have all these really complicated systems which are very fragile. And if you perturb them a little bit, you push them a little bit, the marketplace will collapse. And then it rebuilds itself, but it's in a completely new configuration. So the concept of cascading disruption is being that first mover to enter a marketplace, whether it be social media or financial markets, or it be you know, some type of industry like supply chain management. And then once it collapses, it rebuilds itself into something that's completely different. And the hope is that it's transparent, it's open, it's fair, it has different principles behind it. So in a sense, what we wanted to do was build a company on both the research and the engineering side that would facilitate these types of things. We would go and say, let's look at the state of social media, whether that be Facebook or MySpace, you know, these things, and they have a certain configuration, they have a certain notion of how people are brought together, how data is controlled, your privacy, and can we invent a protocol that once released will completely change that whole market? And it doesn't matter if we're still in business, we're still around. We could be like Netscape and completely disappear. Well, the market's still changed. It's still in that type of configuration. And we want to do that for all industries where there's actually people.
All industries.
All industries. That we can figure out that makes sense. I don't know, you want to add anything to that?
Well, you know, coming from, when we were working on the Ethereum project, there were a lot of angry people.
Yeah.
There was a lot of politics involved, but there was also a lot of technical people who said, you can't do what you're doing. It's just not, it can't be done, don't even try. And so when we started IOHK, we wanted to have a place where we could experiment with technology.
That's actually an excellent transition into my next question. So one of the unique things that IOHK has done is you guys have taken a very onerous approach in trying to implement peer review, formal methods. Now this is something that has been more established in more traditional fields like, you know, basic science and technology, but it's not something that we see dominating the cryptocurrency space. So, Jeremy, you had a really awesome quote where you said, experimentation is the mother of discovery, and I'm sure that that has something to do with this decision. So, tell us about the decision to take this path and why you think it's so important.
You know, it was one of the things we struggled with, because, you know, you get the Silicon Valley mentality of move fast and break things, and it doesn't matter if the product works or not. But I was so adamant, I said, scientific claims require scientific validation. You know, how many people here are cryptocurrency investors who have bought a cryptocurrency? You've invested or read a white paper? Like a lot of people, right? And every one of these white papers says stuff like provably secure or 10,000 transactions per second. I mean, EOS was probably the worst offender. And then you ask yourself, well, how many of those claims have actually been vetted by a third party? Simple question, right? And an independent third party that doesn't have skin in the game and doesn't care whether you live or die, you succeed or not. You're making scientific claims about security, you're making claims about performance, you're making claims about the capabilities of your protocols. Protocol development has been a bedrock of computer science for more than 5 decades. It predates us by a long time, and these people don't give a crap about our industry. So you'd figure if you're making a scientific claim that you would just say, all right, well, let's just submit the paper to a conference, and if they accept it, I go there, talk to the scientists. I, as an investor, have a data point that maybe there's some merit behind what people are saying about their protocol. Real simple, right? But we were the first company to actually seriously invest in this, and it took a lot of effort. We had to build a science division. We went to Tokyo Tech, Scotland, Athens, and we had to hire a bunch of scientists, and we had to submit the papers to conferences. It took 2 years to build this division up. And the other caveat is I for sure thought that BlockChain was going to change the environment. I said, this is a company led by a proper cryptographer. He's the guy who invented proof of work. Adam Back. And they have all these top guys. Many of them have PhDs. They have $76 million in funding. They're sitting in the heart of Silicon Valley. You'd figure that these guys would champion this whole science-first, peer-reviewed methodology, but they just never did it. So we accidentally became like the first firm to really push that, and now we see a lot of imitation. There's Algorand and Thunderella and things like Avalanche, and there's now this whole new wave of academically validated, peer-reviewed scientific research turning into cryptocurrencies. And there's even investments from the incumbents. Ethereum put money into a lab, $5 million into Stanford, and Definity put money into that lab as well. So it's good to see a sea change in the industry. But we just felt it was morally important for the investors to have that third-party independent verification that the claims we're making are true, especially when they're controversial claims, like proof of stake works, or proof of stake is secure, or the incentives are the same as proof of work, or something like that.
Jeremy, I'd like to hear from you on this.
Well, my father's a tool and die maker, and he has this problem all the time when he's making machines, is that the engineer gives him the blueprint, and then the machine builders, they look at it and they just start laughing because there's question marks all over the place. There's things that are just not going to actually work. So one of the big steps that we're doing at IOHK is to make sure that we have that prototype team who can take that peer research, find all the question marks, get answers from the researchers, and actually play around, make the code work.
Right, and that's a really good point because the incentive structures are totally different. If you're a scientist, your goal is to publish papers. That's what gets you tenure, that's what gets you ahead in life. It doesn't necessarily mean that these protocols are practical and they can be implemented easily and that they make realistic assumptions for our industry. So there needs to be a translation step between engineering and science, something that lives in the middle, that prototyping, where we extract from the paper a specification and we actually understand whether the thing would actually run and be realistic and be real. Like the first version of Ouroboros was a great piece of theory. It said, here's what a blockchain is, proof of work creates a secure version of it, and proof of stake can create the same type of ledger. But it wasn't a practical protocol in terms of how it operated. And we needed to spend 2 years and write 5 more papers to show how to tease out practicality. But there was a beautiful feedback loop where we wrote the Ouroboros paper, and then there were these great engineers who looked at it, wrote prototypes, extracted all this data from it, and said, look, we need to clean this up and this up and this up. And gradually you started seeing a more and more practical protocol, which is still provably secure. So you have kind of the best of both worlds. And it's really hard to do that.
So one of the things that IOHK does is you guys haven't gone directly in one direction, right? So with Cardano, you guys are you're working on proof of stake. With Ethereum Classic, you guys are still developing proof of work. I believe with some of the work you do with Zencash, you're working on DAG systems.
Right.
So you consider IOHK a research company as much as a blockchain development company? Or is there a particular reason why you guys haven't coalesced on one specific direction?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. The businesses in this space, they start with a protocol and they work their way backwards to a business. IOHK is an engineering company. We're agnostic. We say, look, we can build token A or token B. It just so happens that our portfolio is biased towards Cardano because it's our biggest project. But at the end of the day, we'd like to be in many industries. We'd like to be in IoT. We'd like to be in social media. We'd like to do something in privacy. And eventually we will enter these spaces. So what we do is we start with the science and we say, what's the total design space and the collection of trade-offs that exist within that design space of what we can do with cryptocurrency technology? If you want to make something private, what do you give up for what you gain? If you want to make something fast, what do you give up for what you gain? And so the whole job of the researchers is to try to make those trade-off profiles more desirable. Okay, so instead of taking a 1980s protocol like what EOS did and then bolting on some voting system and say, okay, look, we have something. Let's actually try to build a custom protocol for the actual business and technical requirements. And that means we get to keep all that goodness that came from the 80s, but maybe give up some less on the decentralization side, for example. So that's what we do there. Now, commercially, the advantage we live in, when Jeremy and I were in Osaka years ago talking about this, was that there's an oversupply of capital in our space relative to engineers and talent. So we took a strategic bet that you could be a protocol-agnostic engineering and science company, and you'd be able to pick and choose your winners and losers. You'd be able to decide who do we want to work with, how do we want to work with them, and we've had to turn down a lot of business, especially in the ICO mania in 2017.
So the down market is really just a rebalancing of capital and engineering talent?
Well, it's funny because a lot of these guys exited. They sold at the top, and so they're now flushed with cash, but they don't actually have the scientific or engineering talent, and they have a deficit between the promises they made to their investors and the actual capabilities of their protocols to deliver. When you say you can do 100,000 transactions per second, you have side chains and perfect smart contracts that never have bugs, I don't know what mountaintop you've come down with those clay tablets from God, but I want to know what its address. I want to know where that thing is, because it doesn't exist. It's mystical. It's going to require half a decade or more of research to get close to that, and you're still going to have to give up some things or centralize your network in certain ways to do that. And so I think investors are starting to realize what they were sold is not practical. And the problem is that you now have these projects that are sitting on mountains of cash. And they took that money to deliver those promises. So, we're in a good position to try to help them where we can, but you just got to pick and choose and be careful about it.
So the next question I have for you guys is a little bit philosophical, but I know you both got into the space because of Bitcoin. You were involved early on in Ethereum. You were a co-founder of Ethereum. And we know that this space was developed with a heavy emphasis on a type of anarchic libertarian philosophy. IOHK specifically considers its mission as building blockchains for universities, governments, institutions. So I think as the space matures, we're realizing that those initial philosophies of what cryptocurrency could be doesn't necessarily completely merge with the reality of having major institutions take on this space. So I guess my question for both of you, as people who got involved in this space for these philosophical reasons and now working on the practical side of that, is how do you see this playing out and actually, if the direction is universities, governments, and institutions, how does that merge with the philosophy that got you involved in this space in the first place?
You want to start with how you got involved in the space?
Well, some of the original ideas are still good ideas. For instance, you don't own your ID on the internet, right? Usually you get your ID from Google or Apple, right? And then if those companies shut you down, your ID is gone, you've lost access to a lot of different accounts. So we still need to make good on those early promises. So that's one of the things that I hope to do with IOHK.
Right. And, in terms of the conflict, we recognize it as well, and we realize that we're kind of two companies in one. Within those two companies, we're like four companies. We have an enterprise notion, and that's what universities and governments and big businesses care about. And there's actually clear, real things that matter there. Like if you're doing coffee farming in Ethiopia, there's 1.5 million farmers that we have to figure out how to put into a supply chain. And you really don't gain a lot going beyond the government in terms of putting them into a blockchain. So that's a natural place for an enterprise ledger solution. Same for voting systems, the same for property registration and business registration systems. If your legitimacy comes from the state for the business, why the hell are you trying to put it on Ethereum or something like that? Just have the state run the blockchain. But by having the chain itself, you have fraud protection. But then on the other side, there's this idealistic side of IOHK, which what Jeremy mentioned, this whole concept of like owning your identity, owning your money. And in some ways, these things do need to be transnational, and you do need to have insulation from governments, even my own. I mean, I'm deathly scared of things like civil asset forfeiture, and I see social credit getting rolled out in China. And I realize that if these things don't exist, then we're just going to live in a dystopian world where a very small group of people, at any time, if you piss them off, can just shut you off. They can shut you down, turn off your identity, turn off your money, kill your property ledger, and you just disappear. It's almost like Stalinist Russia, where you get blotted out of the paper. You've been airbrushed out of the painting. So to me, you have to have a balance in your portfolio, and how you achieve that balance is you have different teams. You have different developers, different legal structures, and you have different clients and different brands. So the enterprise brand lives in its own world, and the crypto brand lives in its own world, and there's plenty of examples of that. Philip Morris is a giant company, and if you smoke cigarettes, you're buying their products, but they also have Kraft mac and cheese. So somehow they've been able to get those two families to live under the same corporate umbrella, and I think we can find a stable balance there. But what's nice is that the two portfolios borrow from each other in terms of technology. So if we have a major innovation on, let's say, the network stack or in cryptography, like making things quantum resistant, the same code base can be repurposed for both of these ledgers. They're just used different, and they have different power structures behind them.
All right, so there's multiple sides, obviously, to this space. You guys are excellent with the technological side, and now I want to ask you a little bit about governance. Mm-hmm. So blockchains have
we've had some interesting times there.
Absolutely. I think you know where this is going, right? So we've seen in this space from the very beginning, Bitcoin Cash, you were a part of Ethereum and the split with Ethereum Classic, and now Cardano has gone through its own with the Cardano Foundation. But the angle that I'm really interested in is that the way you designed the separation of powers between Emergo, IOHK, and the Cardano Foundation was specifically foreseeing an event like this. So my question is, as these projects get bigger and bigger, and we really try to achieve that goal of going from 1 million to 100 million to 2 billion people, what are the challenges that are coming down the road, and how can these projects prepare for that level of scale?
The thing about governance is you first have to deeply understand incentives, and you have to look into your crystal ball and look out 12 months, 24 months, 36 months in the future and ask yourself, once you add money and power, who has an incentive to do what, and where are we going to conflict with each other? In Ethereum, one of the things we did really wrong is that, in the beginning, everybody was friends because we had no money and power and no one took us seriously. In fact, Mo wouldn't even give us a prominent speaking role at the Miami Bitcoin conference. We were kind of banished to a tier 3 room, and nobody took us seriously, and now Ethereum's like a big thing, right? But so when we were little, everybody loved each other. We were all friends, we all got along, and it got pretty Lord of the Flies there, after a while. And why? Because suddenly people realized that this is real. We're going to get rich. And when you have 8 founders, and you have this business wing, and you have this tech wing, and I was in the middle trying to be, let's all get along and peacemaker, you're going to break one way or the other. So with Cardano, we said, look, somebody's got to worry about the venture portfolio and investing in DAOs. You kind of need this like consensus style company. And then somebody needs to worry about the technology, and then somebody needs to worry about the community management and exchange listings and government outreach and so forth. And if they all live in their own camps and they're doing their jobs, they don't overlap too much. So they don't really have incentives to try to conflict. They actually have an incentive to work together as 3 entities, except for cases where one of the entities is not doing its job, and then it's just a matter of the other 2 picking up the slack for the greater good of the ecosystem, which is what we did, and that's nearly resolved. But moving beyond that, that's only a temporary thing. You have a second thing, which is, well, how do you decentralize these projects? How do you go beyond the founding companies and actually turn them to what Linux has turned into, with 800 companies working on it, and everybody uses it in billions of devices? Linux doesn't really have a lot of influence or power over that ecosystem now. So you need a good improvement proposal process. You need lots of meetup groups. You need a voting system for people to express their will, even if it's non-binding. Just the ability to poll people and ask them, well, what do you think about this? Gives you a voice, and it gives you an influence and a way of doing things. Like the petition to get rid of Michael Parsons. 6,000 people signed that, verifiable people. That wasn't a binding petition, but it showed an overwhelming interest within this small community that management changes need to happen, and it definitely did help. So these types of things are necessary. And then you also always have the final disagreement, which is the Ethereum Classic or the Bitcoin Cash route, where if there are irreconcilable differences, the project needs to fork. Now, the advantage of a project forking is that you get kind of the best of both worlds if you do it correctly. Because, at some point, mommy and daddy have to break up, and they don't like each other. And if they stay together, the kids are going to get terribly traumatized and need years of therapy. So similarly, if you're a big blocker and you're a SegWitter, or you believe in immutability, or you believe whatever Vitalik says is law, at some point you just can't keep getting along. And so when you split, now you have two ecosystems where people actually get along. And now they're free to innovate. Instead of trying to always compromise and make a deal and dilute the vision a little bit and give them half and give that. It's like the United States when we had slavery. You know, it's like you're not going to get an abolitionist to say that's okay. It's like you can't compromise with them and say, hey, can we just have slavery on the weekdays, but on the weekends they can go out fishing? That's like not a deal. They're saying, no, the whole institution is broken. So they had to split, and then they resolved it.
But Charles, let me push. Are you foreseeing a future where the solution is constant forking?
I don't think you can avoid it. I think there's things you can do to allow your community to govern itself, but inevitably people are people, and the reason why we have many religions and languages and currencies is just that, because people have a difference of opinion. This is not like TCP/IP. You know, this is a situation where it's your money, it's your property, it's your view of how the world should work. And the whole point of this space is to give you a tailor-made solution for that particular view, which is why we're necessarily going to have thousands of these types of things. And it's why it's important to do agnostic research. It's why we still do research in proof of work as well as proof of stake. Why we do research in privacy-preserving systems and systems that are made for auditing and for regulatory use. We're as much a reg tech company as we are a privacy company. Because at the end of the day, you're going to use these things differently for different people, and the point is to give people a choice. This is why we're going to continue to see classics and caches. But it's important to differentiate between classic and cache and these types of inevitable growth factors and just plain old failures of governance. Like what happened with Tezos, or some would argue what happened with us with Cardano and the foundation. In those cases, that's where there's an entity that is given a job, it's given money, it's given a purpose, and it just simply doesn't do it. Good governance is about getting rid of that stuff. Right. Good governance cannot get rid of the classic Ethereum debate, because ultimately that's about philosophy.
Right.
And you can have 100% voting and participation, you're still going to have irreconcilable differences. You have some people on the left side of the room say, I signed up for X, and you have some people on the right side of the room say, I signed up for Y. They're not going to change their mind.
And values will change.
Yes.
Jeremy, I want to ask you, I'm purely hypothetical, or we're trying to foresee, but do you think we've seen the worst of the governance crisis in this space, or are we just getting a taste of what's to come?
So we're talking about the meat space, the real world governance issues. No, people are very difficult. They're not always rational either. There's egos involved as well. I mean, one of the great hopes about moving governance to the blockchain is that you can get a lot more transparency around actions. So, but that also is going to be an experiment in the first years. So we don't exactly know how that's going to turn out either.
Right, and it's so painful. And the other thing is we're moving our way through governance. I mean, implicit in all these conversations is this concept of how do you run an organization, whether that be a business or a government. And we've had, as human beings, over the last few thousand years, a lot of different ways of doing it. But generally, they all tend to converge to the strong man, the great leader at the top who, when times get tough, will materialize and, like Cincinnatus, come and save us. And then we hope they go back to the farm. They seldom do. Yeah. We hope that they do that. Well, what we're doing with cryptocurrencies is killing the strong man. We're saying it's not a human being, it's a protocol, and there is now rules here, and there's a decentralized way of making decisions, and human beings aren't so good at that. It's never really been the case where we've had that at a large scale for large-scale coordination. We're pretty good at doing it at the tribal level, like when we know all of our neighbors and social pressures keep everybody in line. But doing that in the scale of millions to billions is a new thing. And that's what cryptocurrencies are forcing the world to contend with, are these objects which are transhuman, and they don't have an ethnicity or a culture or a language behind them. And yet somehow we make decisions for the good of that ecosystem when everybody else has special interests. Right, and what's nice is that the failures are public. That's what Jeremy was saying. We've never had that either. When they fail, we see these caches and these classics and these Tezos style things, but they're in the public. There's no way to hide that. Yeah, so you get beautiful data points of what went wrong. So every time a failure occurs, you can study that and change things accordingly. Whereas a lot of cases when failures occur, they happen behind closed doors, and we never actually hear those stories unless you're a historian or you were in that room or something like that.
I have to take advantage of that because this is going to lead me to my last question. Unfortunately, we only have 30 minutes. I could talk to you guys for hours about this kind of stuff, but...
And I'd love to get a question from the audience if we have enough.
Absolutely. Do we have enough time? Let's go ahead and lead that. Do we have any questions in the audience?
You can ask us anything.
We'll give you a minute to come up with a question while I ask you a quick one. All right, so IOHK guys, Cardano specifically, there's a unique level of historical awareness and reverence. I mean, you guys mentioned, obviously, Cardano himself, Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron, Basho, Voltaire. This is kind of a selfish question as a historian myself, but do you guys ever think about the role that you might be playing as a central company in a central space that might drastically change, and what do you want that legacy to be?
I'll be dead. It doesn't matter. Whoever finds my corpse, I'm going to go raise alpacas and yaks, and I won't think too much about it.
Jeremy?
The question one more time.
You guys ever think about the historical role you're playing, being central in an industry that people believe can drastically change humanity?
No, actually, I haven't thought about it, actually.
Well, it's funny, it's like you look at Microsoft or Apple or these guys in the 70s, and I had no idea that they were building an entire revolution. And the same for Zuckerberg and Larry Page. And we see the cryptocurrency revolution. When I signed up for my first cryptocurrency meetup group, there was 2 people, myself and another person who registered, and the other guy didn't show up. So I had a nice conversation with myself, which I often do. But anyway, it's like now it's this huge movement where you go to Mongolia and you see a camel herder and the guy has Bitcoin. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. So in a certain extent, it's already one of the most amazing experiences going to over 50 countries in the last 5 years and seeing all these people and learning all these things. But yet the best is to come. And there's going to be some major conflicts, I think, to come. There's definitely a movement, and we've seen it the last 15 years, maybe 20, where big data combined with this global nature of everybody being interconnected, combined with AI, is creating a situation where governments can now monitor all their people. And they get to decide what good behavior is and what bad behavior is. And they're going to kill cash. Cash is going to go away in the next 20, 30 years. So given those two forces, they're kind of coming up against cryptocurrencies and our movement as the freedom movement. We're talking about owning your own identity, owning your own property, owning your own land, actually being in charge of these things, and freedom of communication, freedom of movement. So these two forces aren't compatible, and they're going to have a big conflict. So if we're a major part of that or a minor part of that, I don't know, I can't say, but I do know that that's going to be the big struggle of the first half of the 21st century, is sorting out what are your rights given this century. Last century, if you look at the year 1900, the world was ruled by kings. There's a famous picture, it was at Edward V's, I think, or one of those Edwards. He died and he was King of England, and he was related basically to almost every monarch in all of Europe. So at his funeral, I believe it was 1912, they had all these kings here. And if you look at the picture, half of the world was ruled by these people. They had half of the world's money, half of the world's armies. And within just 8 years, at the end of World War I, almost all of them had been deposed and wiped out, and the whole world had a new structure. And then throughout the whole 20th century, we had to decide, what is this world going to look like? Is it going to be communism or democracy? And there's going to be free markets or controlled markets? And now we're entering the 21st century, and we're having that conversation all over again.
Cascading disruption again.
Exactly. What is the world going to look like? And you can make arguments, maybe it would look better or run better under a Chinese-style government. Or maybe it'd look better and run better under a free democracy, free market style thing. You also have environmental questions of, is what we're doing sustainable over the next 100 or 200 years? So as we try to answer those questions, what we build are a collection of neutral tools. They can be used in a tyrannical way or in a free way. What we do is we build those tools, we put them into the open domain, and we give them to the world to decide how to use them and how to configure them. I think that's going to be the real story.
So we are technically over time. I want to give one more chance.
Karim, we've got a couple of questions here as well.
Perfect.
We'll just take them. Just take a couple of ones.
You already answered in some way my question, but it was, you have such kind of a prophetic, idealistic approach to the system from the beginning on. And when you go onto the market, into the ecosystem right now, how do you think your ideals are reflected in the system? I mean, are we going into the right direction? Are we converging in the right direction?
Well, you know, it's funny because the cryptocurrency space proved the need for the cryptocurrency space. And what I mean by that is the minute that we got a little bit of money and power as an industry, what the hell did we do? We created ICO mania and no one really gave a crap. Guys, I was disgusted in 2017 and most of this year when I saw things like BitConnect and I talked to exchanges that listed it. And they would tell me, oh yeah, we know it's a scam, we know it's a Ponzi scheme, but we're getting great fees on this. You know, and so it really tells you that human beings are people. And they're not going to suddenly change because they're all idealistic. You know, oh, we're all good faith and we're going to be nice people. No. The minute they get wealth and power, we all get corrupted and we become horrible and we're terrible. There are no exceptions. So the whole point of having protocols run things is they're dispassionate. They don't give a shit. It's like gravity. There's been at least one mountain climber who's wished that the laws of gravity doesn't apply to him, usually as he's falling to his death. And similarly, markets are the same way. You know, if you have stable rules, what that means is there's going to be losers for winners. And there's going to be at least one grandmother or at least one kid or at least one good, honest, nice person who gets screwed and loses out, loses everything. But you say, look, for the sake of stability, for the sake of this marketplace being fair for everyone, we have to accept the winners with the losers. But we as human beings don't like that. We like all the benefits, we like all the upside, but the minute the losses come, we want to get rid of them and change everything and make exceptions and bailouts and special cases. So this is kind of a new thing of creating an artificial laws of physics and applying it to an industry as a whole. And what our industry is doing is just reinventing all the agency failures that we've seen in the historical financial markets. I mean, if you look at the Knickerbocker crisis in 1908, well, you know, it's the same situation we had right now, where everybody was on each other's boards, rampant insider trading, tons of interconnected companies. You know, a certain privileged group of people got first access to the information, traded on it, made fortunes on it, and the retail investors got screwed. And it got so bad it bankrupted the United States, and J.P. Morgan had to bail everybody out. So we're just reinventing what happened at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, and we're doing it with a modern flair and modern terminology. But human nature hasn't changed. The difference is this technology now allows us to examine those failures and turn them into protocols so that they can't happen again, and it doesn't require trusted regulators or trusted good moral people.
Was that Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure rhymes?
Yeah, exactly. And George Lucas said the same thing, right?
Do we have another question in the audience? Oh, right here.
Sorry, okay. Hey, thanks very much for the talk. I'm Quincy from Revision Germany, Berlin. You guys want to change the world, as I understood. So I was wondering how we can use, or what you think how we can use the blockchain technology to create more open, better governments, and especially drive back the right-wing surge we see at the moment in US and Europe.
Well, I mean, you have right and left-wing surges, and you know, if you push too far in one direction, you have a counterbalance in the other direction. You have to understand that people aren't used to being in this hyper-connected, hyper-global community. Historically, humans have lived in silos, and then there's been these connection points between the silos, and those are the people that tend to control everything. Then the internet comes out, and we were not prepared for that. We broke all the silos up and said, okay, suddenly somebody in Zimbabwe could have the same access to information as a person living in New York City or the Emperor of Japan. It's pretty crazy if you think about these things, right? So people started moving around, ideas started moving around, and what you're seeing is the natural, predictable human friction. So we got a bit too globalistic, and now there's a right-wing movement to try to push us back into a more nationalistic movement, and it'll settle down. So I don't try to take political sides and say one is right or the other is wrong. What we try to do as a company is we worry about the protocols and we worry about the science and we worry about the capabilities. Like, for example, is it possible to vote anonymously but know that your vote's been counted correctly? And to do this at a very low cost and not have to have a paper ballot and do it online. If you can do that and you can franchise that, suddenly you can have this enterprise-grade, super awesome election system that can be used at every level, from your Boy Scout club all the way up to a nation state. They have the same tool set. And to do that in an open source way and build that tool, it's a remarkable thing if you really think about that. Another thing is we have this huge issue in academia right now. Identity politics have caused huge problems where people feel they're being censored and they can't really speak up. Like these two academics decided to publish a bunch of fake papers just to see if, what the publication standards are behind feminist theory. And they wrote 20 papers in 1 year, and 8 of them got accepted for publication. One of which, they took Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, and they just replaced the Jewish race with white men, and they actually got published. So that privately, all these academics came up to them and said, we love what you're doing, it's great work, thank you so much. And I said, can you publicly support us? And they say, oh no, it's career suicide. So you have to ask yourself whether, whatever side you live in that movement, is it a legitimate thing to have people live in fear of expressing their opinions and expressing their beliefs, especially when their beliefs are somewhat legitimate, we would argue. So it would be really nice if you had systems where people anonymously, but you could verify that they are a member of a set, like a university faculty, could actually demonstrate that 80, 90, 95% of the people working at an organization happen to believe the CEO is a bad guy, or happen to believe that one particular philosophy is causing a lot of issues. But they're afraid individually to speak up because they get brutally attacked or ostracized and so forth. So, in a certain respect, I think that's our role as a company, is not to take sides, but rather to say there are all kinds of things that are happening as a consequence of globalism, as a consequence of these markets the way they are. And what we can do is build tools to allow everybody in this room to navigate those things, whatever they happen to be, whatever political philosophy they happen to have, and navigate them in a way where they can express their opinion and their will without fear of reprisal. They have economic freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, whatever that might be. It's the same for journalism. There's all these atrocities and horrors that are occurring in Africa, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, South America, and nobody wants to talk about them. We know about them, we see them, people feel them, people die, they get oppressed, but they can't talk about it because they're afraid if they do, there'll be the one guy who does, and as a result, they get a bullet in the head. But the same technology that allows that professor to say maybe it's a bad deal there would allow a journalist in Iran to talk about the persecution of gays, or allow somebody in Congo to talk about that, or somebody in Venezuela to talk about government corruption, for example. You see? And that's our role, is to build those tools, make them open, give them to the world, and then once you have them, you get to decide what you want to do with them.
Charles, I'd like to very quickly, before we take the next question, kind of expand on your question and take it to Jeremy, rather than just from the side of, decrease the right-wing search or the left-wing search, and playing off of what you're saying, Charles, do you believe that this technology can play a role in reducing extremism and the polarization of society by increasing trust in institutions?
Well, I'll give you a recent example, is that I was reading reviews on schools for my children online, and some people were really angry at the school. I have no idea who those people are, but they influenced me. So suddenly now I don't trust the school. I'm like, well, should I send my kids here? But who are these people? I don't know. It would have been really nice if there was a way for people to prove membership, but also be able to say what they want. That way I know, these people are legit, they did go to the school, and their opinion reflects the school.
Right. And just think about the power of that kind of an attack. These schools aren't big entities. A lot of people are small, medium-sized business owners. And for just maybe a few $100s of social engineering, you can destroy a vendor's online reputation. Whether it be an Amazon product or a school review, and then suddenly Jeremy doesn't want to go there.
Or create one from scratch.
Exactly. Exactly. Next question.
But this is the last question as well, then we're going to break for lunch.
My name is Eric Mom with CoinMarketCap. I am the community manager. And I had a question regarding community building. And part of the main initiatives that we have, besides providing data to the cryptosphere, what are your thoughts basically on building communities for protocols and different projects, or a company like us?
Well, first, thank you for all your work at CoinMarketCap. I think it's a website I go to on a daily basis, and most of us do. And it's really amazing how something so simple can be so powerful. I think the most powerful thing you can do is look at key leader profiling and key leader engagement. So with all communities, you have a philosophy, you have a kind of a raison d'etre. There's a reason to exist. There's a purpose. And what you need to do is identify surrogates, people who are bigger than your average bear. People actually care more than the normal person. And what's nice about this space is that people tend to hire themselves. Some of the best employees I've ever had, some of the best people I've ever worked with, they didn't, I didn't call them up and say, hey, can you work for me? Or, I didn't go and just go to a recruiter and, say, go find someone. They had a podcast. They had a blog. They were doing things. Look at Emergo with Sebastian, one of their best guys, if not the best guy on their team. And how did they find him? He was creating podcasts. He was creating YouTube videos going over the weekly reports and the source code as we were making it. Now, no one told him to do that. He just started doing it of his own free will. We recently set up a podcast for Cardano. It's called The Cardano Effect. Rick and Philip, where did they come from? They were doing their own videos about Cardano. So finding those people, those key leaders, profiling them, and then going and engaging them and giving them the resources they need to just keep doing what they're already doing, then once you've done that, you can build a movement around those people. And those people can eventually become major surrogates. That was one of the keys to success with Ethereum. We had a meetup group strategy. We had 50 meetup groups on 5 continents in under 6 months. And that was one of the reasons why Ethereum had the largest ICO. It was one of the reasons why Ethereum had the fastest community building, and Consensus doubled down on that. And they really helped construct a good ecosystem. Another thing is, if you have a really strong, compelling philosophy, you're probably not the only player in that space, and you're probably not the first person to come up with that. The cryptocurrency space is the spiritual successor of the cypherpunk movement, and it's a spiritual successor of things like the Ron Paul movement, where people were talking about sound money, which in itself came from Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard and Hayek, like 100 years of Austrian economic history there. So what's the natural growth pattern? Just go talk to those people who have existed before you and interface with those people, and then suddenly you'll wake up and you have 500,000, 1 million people that are there to go. Transparency is the other thing, too. I do a lot of AMAs. I don't have to, but I do them. And it's important because people want to be able to ask you questions. So just being able to face your customer and face your community, and especially when times are hard. It's easy to be popular when times are good. 8 is $1. There's Jesus Charles that appears, and everybody loves me, right? But 8 is 4 cents. I get death threats. I actually do. But you have to face your community. You have to talk to people, and having the courage to do that, answer hard questions, and share in that mutual misery in some cases is what gets you through and allows you to survive and grow.
So just to clarify, Charles thinks podcasters are an untapped pool of talent.
And actually, they reach a lot of people, too. If you look at the intellectual dark web, it's more popular than most television shows. They get millions and millions of views and have engaged views. When you're talking about a television show, and maybe you have 3 or 4 minutes of actual focused engagement over an hour. You look at like the Joe Rogan Experience, they're talking for 3.5 hours. People actually listen to that for all 3.5 hours and be engaged, and then go to Reddit and talk about it, and then make YouTube videos commenting on it. You don't get that kind of engagement from Fox News or CNN or from CBS.
All right. I think that's going to do it. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.